Let's look at the facts behind the shooting of Andre Hill. Hey, what's going on? My name is Nate, lawyer and YouTuber. If it's your first time here, don't forget to like this video, share this video, and subscribe to the channel if you like what you hear. I'm a former prosecutor, former law enforcement officer, and let's get to it. Today we're talking about the shooting of Andre Hill in Columbus, Ohio. Now, as you know, with all police shootings, we look at things critically. We look at the facts, we look at the law, and then we look at the incident and see if we can combine everything together. And at the end of the day, you are going to be the one who are making the decision whether these officers conducted themselves in a manner that's lawful or whether it was criminal. So first, before we get to the incident, the body cam footage and the police use of force policy for the Columbus Police Department, those links are in the description. Now, first, let's look at the law that governs police use of force. If you've watched my channel before, you know that there are two cases that are the crown jewel of police use of force in the United States. The first case is Tennessee v. Gardner. Now, in Tennessee v. Gardner, police shot a fleeing felon in the back. That case then went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said law enforcement officers aren't able to shoot fleeing felons in the back unless that fleeing felon poses an immediate serious threat to the police officer or members of the community. For instance, if that person is running with a gun shooting at people, then you can shoot that person in the back. Tennessee v. Gardner stands for the proposition that police can use deadly physical force when they have an immediate serious threat of deadly physical force against them or members of the community. This is our serious threat option. And this is the first level of analysis that we have to determine if officers are confronted with a situation where they feel they have to use deadly physical force. There has to be an immediate serious threat. Now, the second case also comes from the Supreme Court. It's called Graham v. Connor. Now, in Graham v. Connor, the Supreme Court set out the rules in which all police use of force conduct is going to be judged. This is what's known as the objectively reasonable standard. Now, this standard is simple. It's asking what a reasonable officer would do based on his training and experience in that situation. So essentially what you're doing is you're putting a reasonable officer in that officer's position and asking the question, would a reasonable officer would have conducted themselves as this officer did or not? So in Graham v. Connor, that court actually gave us some factors, which was not an exhaustive list, of what officers should consider before using force. Like, was the person resisting arrest? Obviously, if the person is resisting arrest, then you're going to use more force. Or what's the nature of the call, right? If you're getting called to an active bank robbery in progress, officers would be justified in, showing up there with guns drawn, versus if you're going to a call of a cat stuck in a tree. Then why are you bringing the SWAT team out? Why are you bringing guns out? That's two different scenarios. So the Graham factors are saying, there are situations in which officers would be justified to use more force or be prepared to use more force, and others less so. So we have these two cases. We have Tennessee v. Gardner, which is our serious threat, and we have Graham v. Connor, which is our objectively reasonable standard. What would a reasonable officer do in that situation? Generally, a reasonable officer is going to follow their departmental policy, right? Their departments train you. And that's why if something goes bad, they usually have those trainers come and testify what they trained you to do, because reasonable officers follow departmental policy. So we also have to look at departmental policy to see what the department is training these officers to do, because that would help you understand what's reasonable and what's not in this particular situation. So let's look at Columbus, Ohio Police Department's policy on use of force, particularly use of deadly physical force. Well, first, let's just look at the general policy statement of when officers should use force and what officers should do to avoid using force. Sworn personnel shall attempt to de-escalate a situation by using trained techniques such as building rapport, communication skills, maintaining a safe distance, utilizing barriers, etc., when it is safe to do so. So what this policy statement seems to try to illustrate is that officers should try to avoid using deadly physical force whenever possible. And here is some techniques that they should do to try to de-escalate situations. Maintaining safe distance. You don't want to put yourself in a situation where you have to use deadly physical force. Then the policy statement goes on to let officers know when deadly physical force is authorized. Sworn personnel may use deadly force when the involved personnel has reason to believe the response is objectively reasonable. Well, that's our Graham v. Connor standard. To protect themselves and others from imminent threat of death or serious physical harm. That is our Tennessee v. Gardner standard. 2. Sworn personnel may use deadly physical force upon a human being to prevent escape, someone running, when there is probable cause to believe that the subject possesses an immediate threat of serious physical harm to others. Again, that's Tennessee v. Gardner. You need a serious physical threat if you're going to use deadly physical force. So now we see how the Police Department has taken our seminal Supreme Court cases and turned them into policy that officers must use if they're employing deadly physical force. Now, last thing, let's look to the policy to see which officers should do after deadly physical force has been used. Quote, use of force resulting in death or serious physical harm likely to cause death. They should, 1, cause any needed medical aid to be rendered. So if you shoot somebody, start rendering medical aid. Immediately cause Communications Bureau personnel to be notified. And 3, secure the scene. So let's get back. These 3 things are paramount if an officer shoots somebody. So now that we know the law and the policy, let's look at this officer's actions and see if we can determine if this officer acted within departmental policy when using deadly physical force against Mr. Hill. Now, before we get into this part of the video, this video is not going to be monetized. Why? Because I have to show you a police shooting. And to really understand how this works in the real world, I have to introduce you to the policy, I have to introduce you to the law, and then I have to introduce you to the actual event. And there's no way I can really censor this out where it wouldn't be demonetized by YouTube. And for good reason. I'm about to show you someone actually getting shot and killed on video. So with that said, I'd appreciate your support. Pick up a channel membership, hitting me up on Patreon, and it helps me make this type of content to educate the public on police tactics, because I think this is highly important. People need to understand not only what happened, but if the law allows it to happen. So if you like this type of content, if you like this type of detailed analysis of both police policy and law, consider supporting the channel. Thanks again. Let's get back to the video. So the first thing we have to understand before we get into the video is what call for service this is. Remember, that's one of the things that a reasonable officer would assess in determining what level of force they should be prepared to use. Remember, if we're going to a bank robbery in progress versus a call for a cat in a tree. So what was a call for service at this particular stage? This was a disturbance call from a neighbor who allegedly saw a man sitting in an SUV for an extended period of time, turning his car on and off. We have a nonviolent call. It's about someone sitting in a car, turning on and off the car. Let's also look at the weather for that day. In Columbus, Ohio, it was a low of about 22 degrees. So at night, you're talking about maybe 20, 30 degrees. That was the air temperature. So someone sitting in their car, turning it on and off on a night where it's about 30 degrees outside. Now, these are the facts known to the officer at that time. Call for someone sitting in their car, turning it off and on a very cold night in Columbus, Ohio. So now we see the officer exiting his vehicle and we don't hear any sound. That's because the officer hasn't activated the body cam. So we're just seeing the video that's more or less always on. You'll hear when the officer does activate the body cam, then the audio will turn on. Now, the first thing I do want you to notice when we look at this body cam footage is here, you see a second officer. So this officer is not alone. There are 2 officers. So here, the officer doesn't go to the front door of the property. The officer goes directly to the garage. Now, the other officer is not here on camera either. So this is one of the bad things about not turning on the body camera, that we can't see if this officer is giving any verbal commands. Stop, let me see your hands, stay back, what are you doing here? Anything like that. We just see the officer just walking up to this suspect. And this suspect has their phone out because it was dark back there. So they seem to have come out the car to figure out who's now coming to the garage. We have to stop the video here because we have to ask our 2 questions. The first question is this officer justified in having his firearm out, right? Based on the call for service. Someone sitting in a car, turning it on and off. Is that more like the cat in a tree or more like bank robbery in progress? Or is it somewhere in between? 2, we have to talk about Tennessee v. Gardner, because the only time an officer can use deadly physical force is if the suspect has shown a threat of deadly physical force to the officer or to members of the community. So at this moment, is this person a serious threat to the officer or to members of the community? If this person is, this officer is then authorized to use deadly physical force. And we're talking about, is this person a threat? The person just got out the car and now is just walking toward the officer. That's a jury question. That's something you have to decide. So now you know the call for service, which the officer has to take into account. And now you see the moments right before anything happened. Is this person a serious threat to this officer's safety at this time? Now, the officer's fired multiple shots and has retreated. Now, this is a good point for us to go back to the policy. Remember, the policy says that officers should maintain safe distance, utilize barriers when it's safe to do so, attempting to de-escalate stuff. So is this officer following policy by going right up to the scene, right up to this person, right, to this suspect? Did this officer maintain a safe distance as required by the policy? Did this officer try to de-escalate the situation? Again, because the body camera wasn't on, we don't know even if this officer gave any verbal commands. Did he say hello? Did he say, who are you? Did he say what you're doing? Did he say, put your hands up? We don't know any of that. We just see this officer fire and retreat. The officer's now turned on his body cam.
Put your fucking hands out to the side. Hands out to the side now. Roll to your stomach now. Yeah. Hey, don't get fucking close. I can't see his fucking hand. Get your hand up from underneath you now. We got a medic coming. Don't move, dude. Fuck.
Now, this is an important part in the video. The officer is given his verbal commands. He sees the person is unresponsive. He goes to check the person to see if the person is still what this officer perceived to be a serious, deadly threat. After checking the suspect, the officer sees no weapon. The officer finds no weapon. But this person that the officer has just shot is obviously in need of medical attention. So let's go back to the policy. The policy states that if an officer has used deadly force, the officer should call for backup, which they did, and call for an ambulance, secure the scene, but any needed medical aid to be rendered. So these officers at this time should be rendering aid to this suspect, this unarmed suspect who have now been shot by this officer. This officer's checked him. This person doesn't have any weapons. Now this officer is bound by the policy to start rendering aid. Now, we don't know the condition of the suspect, but we understand that the sooner aid is rendered, the more likely it is the person to survive. So this officer has not started rendering aid to the suspect who he has shot, who he now knows is unarmed. And the rest of the video is the officer not giving aid and talking to the officers about the situation. You know, they're going to their procedures of an officer-involved shooting. But the point here is that neither this officer nor his partner ever gave Mr. Hill any aid. Again, it's a 30-degree night. He's on the floor, shot. There's no weapon, and neither of these officers has rendered any medical aid. Matter of fact, they didn't render any medical aid for 5 minutes. So is this a violation of the policy? Again, that's something you would have to decide. So at the end of the day, was this officer acting reasonably in the way he handled this particular case? Did this officer follow departmental policy? Was this a lawful use of force by this officer in Columbus, Ohio? Now, at the time of this video, the chief of police in the department has fired this officer. They said this officer did not act within departmental policy by not rendering aid, and it didn't seem this use of force was reasonable based on the circumstances.
Like all of you, I witnessed his critical misconduct firsthand via his body-worn camera. I have seen everything I need to see to reach the conclusion that Officer Coy must be terminated immediately. Some may call this a rush to judgment. It is not. We have an officer who violated his oath to comply with the rules and policies of the Columbus Division of Police. And the consequences of that violation are so great, it requires immediate action. This violation cost an innocent man his life. There are 2 administrative investigations underway. This first investigation is related to Officer Coy's unreasonable use of deadly force, failure to activate his body-worn camera, and failure to render aid to Mr. Hill. The second investigation pertains to the additional officers involved in this incident who either failed to activate their body cameras or failed to render aid.
So this officer was fired, and the district attorney's office is considering whether or not to present charges. But what do you think? Do you think this officer's actions were justified? Do you think that the suspect posed a serious threat to this officer? Do you believe this officer followed departmental policy all the way through? Remember, it's not my opinion that's going to matter. It's going to be your opinion. Let me know what you think in the comment section. My name is Nate, lawyer, YouTuber. I'm out of here. Peace.